Love can be so elusive, yet we are expected to love our fellow Jew. What does it mean? How is it done? This tape presents a number of helpful ideas which will guide us towards this goal. Love is introduced as a feeling of relatedness resulting from the commonality of Jewish souls, and we are given the Hasidic interpretation of Hillel's statement, "What is hateful to you, do not do unto others." We are told how to train ourselves to notice and appreciate the telltale signs of the presence of the divine soul in every Jew, and we are also shown a loving way of responding to the flaws we see in others.
In talking about the love of a fellow Jew, there are obviously two subjects, and both need to be explained. Subject number one, what is love? And number two, what is a Jew? Now, the emotion of love is a rather familiar term. It's been the subject of poets and romantics for centuries. And I don't know that we should go into that, into a description or analysis of what is this thing called love. But as it relates to loving a fellow Jew, we do need something of a definition. There are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. One of them is to feel the pain and the hunger of the poor, and therefore to give charity. The other is to feel the discomfort of a stranger, give him hospitality, not to be cruel even to an animal. These are all specific individual commandments, and they're basically an expression of kindness, of concern, of compassion, or of love. But the commandment to love your fellow Jew seems to imply something beyond giving charity and being hospitable, beyond having compassion, because all of those are separate commandments in and of themselves. So what does the commandment to love a fellow Jew add to the commandments about kindness, generosity, and compassion? Obviously, the emphasis is on loving every Jew, and that itself is the mitzvah. What does it mean to love every Jew? Very simply, it means not to see or make distinctions between Jews, that all Jews are one, all Jews are the same. So when the Torah says that you should love every Jew, what it basically means is become aware of that which makes a Jew Jewish, and that's something all Jews have in common. And thereby, you will love a Jew. You will love all Jews because of this one thing that all Jews have in common. So the actual fulfillment of loving a fellow Jew comes not so much when you do an act of kindness, but rather by studying, inquiring, searching, finding out what it is that makes a Jew Jewish. The Alter Rebbe puts it this way in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says that in general, to love another person means to find something in the other person that is familiar to yourself, something that the two of you have in common. There are those parts of our life, those parts of our existence that give us our individuality. There are those things that make me different from you, and you different from me. Those are the things that separate us. Those are the things that make every individual unique. And there are times when we have to focus on that. We have to know what we are as individuals. What is my particular responsibility, my particular mission in life as an individual, and so on. The mitzvah to love your fellow Jew means to be able to focus on those things that not only don't separate us, but actually make us one. To find that one thing that is universal to all Jews. And once we discover that, then we're in a position to love our fellow Jew. There was a story in a local paper that contained a quote by a priest who now teaches in a university in Israel. When he was asked what is a Jew, his answer was that a Jew is someone who is religious without knowing it. Religious without knowing it. And that this condition, this definition, is true of all Jews, from the extreme right to the extreme left, and even a Jew converting to Christianity, he says, does so with a uniquely Jewish flavor. Actually, Torah said it a long time ago. Af al pi shechoto Yisrael hu. That even a Jew who sins, who violates his Jewishness remains a Jew. Which means to say that a Jew is not created out of virtue. You don't become a Jew because of mitzvahs or accomplishments or good deeds. And you therefore cannot stop being a Jew because of faults, because of sin or misconduct. So no matter what a Jew does, he remains a Jew. No matter how much good a Jew does, he remains a Jew. Because the state of being Jewish precedes any choices you're going to make. It precedes morality or immorality in your behavior. So long before we decide whether we're going to be good or not, long before we decide whether we're going to put on tefillin or keep kosher or keep Shabbos or go to the mikveh, we are already Jewish. And no matter what decision we come to later in life, that Jewishness doesn't change, is not diminished at all. In different words, there is that part of godliness, that part of God that he breathes into the body, which remains always a part of himself. And that's what we all have in common. Because of it, we are capable, in the very real, literal sense of the word, of loving every Jew. It's not just a high-minded concept, it's a reality. Because that which makes me Jewish is exactly the same as what makes every other Jew Jewish. And if I love that part of me, then I automatically love every other Jew because of it for the same reason. So the Alter Rebbe says, if I emphasize in my own life, if I find great virtue and great significance and importance in those things that make me different, namely my human physical condition, then I'm incapable of loving not only all Jews, I can't love even a single Jew. I can love nobody. Because the most important thing to me is what makes me different. And that which makes me different separates me from everybody. And since I'm focusing on differences, I can't connect with anybody else. The only way to be capable of loving another person is by making those things about myself that make me different and separate unimportant in my own estimation, secondary in my own mind, and what is primary in my mind, in my self-worth, is that which I share with everybody else, meaning to say my Jewish soul. If I appreciate within myself the Jewishness of my soul, then I've opened myself up to every neshama in the world. Every Jew has a neshama, the same neshama, and therefore I've already taken a giant step towards loving every Jew. To some degree, consciously or unconsciously, we all sense this. We all know that there's a physical me, a human me, and then there's also a mystical me. There's what I know about myself and what makes me who I am, and there's a part of me that I don't completely understand, and that's what makes me Jewish. Nobody completely understands their own Jewishness. We surprise ourselves from time to time with how Jewish we really are, or how deeply we feel our Jewishness, or in how many ways being Jewish affects our behavior, even though we didn't notice, and certainly didn't give much thought to. That's the mystical side. What this priest in Israel meant when he said, a Jew is religious without knowing it. So we sense that. And to the degree that we sense it within ourselves, to that degree we are sensitive and committed to our fellow Jew. So that we won't go into a discussion of whether this is moral or ethical or egalitarian, but the fact is that when we hear something over the radio, that some terrible deed was committed, our first impulse is to say, I hope he wasn't Jewish. Not only because it would reflect badly on us, but because that's how we are. To some degree, an American would say, I hope he wasn't an American. But you can point to the country, to the language, to the culture that Americans share in common. And therefore, it bridges the gaps between them and makes them care about each other. But here we're talking about a Jew worrying about another Jew with whom he has nothing in common. They don't have a common culture, they don't have a common country, they don't have a common language or diet. What then do they have in common? Some vague title, because both are called Jews. Is that enough to make my heart miss a beat because of something that is happening to the other heart? There's got to be more than that. It's not just the title Jew. In other words, what two Jews have in common who have never seen each other and do not share the same culture, language, or diet must be as real and as strong and as tangible as two people who do share a language and a country and a culture and a diet, if not stronger. And all this depends on how we see ourselves. If to me my body is more important than my soul, then I am the only thing of importance, because my body doesn't care for anybody else. There's advice given in Hasidus that if a person has a problem in their spiritual growth and development, they should discuss it with another person. And then, when two sit together and discuss a godly problem, you have two godly souls against one animal soul, against one evil inclination. Chances are that you're going to find a solution and you're going to win. But the obvious question is, if you have two people, and therefore two godly souls, you also have two animal souls. So how does this work that the two godly souls outnumber the animal soul? There are two animal souls. But the truth is, godly souls will get together and cooperate on this project, but two animal souls do not cooperate. It's against their nature to cooperate. An animal soul means a selfish soul. A selfish soul may want to sin, but it has no interest in having anybody else sin. It gets no pleasure from anybody else's sins. And therefore my animal soul will not join your animal soul in its sinfulness. But my godly soul is naturally concerned and sympathetic to other godly souls, because that's how godly souls are. So if to me my animal being, my human being, my conscious being, my ego, is most important to me, then I'm separated from everybody else in the world, because nobody shares my ego. Nobody cares about my ego. Nobody wakes up disturbed at night because I'm hungry. Those things I don't share with anybody. And if those are the things that are important to me, then I'm all alone. Or as the Alter Rebbe says, I am incapable of loving anybody other than for ulterior motives. But I cannot really connect with another person's being. I can only connect with that which they can do for me. If, on the other hand, for myself, within myself, what is important is the fact that I'm Jewish, and therefore I serve God a certain way, well, that opens me up to every other Jew. Because every Jew serves God the same way. We have only one God, only one Torah, we have only one Jewish soul. So when we emphasize the soul that we have in common, then we become one people. And it's literally possible to love every Jew. How do we go about this? In practical terms, it means seeing through the differences that separate one Jew from another. What would separate one Jew from another? A style of clothing? That's petty. Obviously, we see through that. Difference in culture and language? Of course, we see through that. But there's a typical common scene. Two Jews meet at an airport, someplace in the middle of Europe. One doesn't speak Hebrew, the other doesn't speak English. And yet, there's an immediate kinship there. Even though there's no way to communicate because of the language barrier. But you hear that there's another Jew in the airport and you feel connected, at home. So obviously, we can see past language barriers, past culture barriers, clothing barriers. What might confuse us, what might set up a rift between Jews, is degrees of observance. The perfectly righteous and holy person might feel that he has nothing in common with a sinful person. The sinful, unlearned person might feel that he has nothing in common with the scholarly, pious Jew. And it's precisely this difference between Jews that the Baal Shem Tov in his teachings came to dispel. That's why the Baal Shem Tov taught two things. First of all, you have to love your fellow Jew even if you've never seen him. In other words, you don't have any shared experiences. You don't have to share anything at all beyond the fact that you're Jewish. That itself is enough to create a bridge and a bond between one Jew and another. So you can love a Jew you've never seen, and we do, because we hear of terrible things that happened, and right away we hope it wasn't a Jew. What do you care if it was a Jew? You've never seen him. You don't know him. But that doesn't matter. If he's Jewish, you care. The second thing is that you have to love the wicked along with the righteous. Why? Because we don't love a Jew for his righteousness. We love a Jew because he's Jewish. Well, then you love the Jew who is wicked as well. If you don't love a Jew because he is righteous, then you don't dislike him when he's not. The important question, the overriding consideration is he Jewish? Is she Jewish? If she is, if he is, then that's your fellow Jew. And so the Baal Shem Tov says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, love your fellow Jew as you love yourself, means the righteous along with the wicked. The Alter Rebbe came along and explained it further. He said that when the Baal Shem Tov says to love the righteous and the wicked, he didn't mean to make it two separate subjects, two different loves. It doesn't mean that you certainly love the righteous and you also love the wicked. No. What he really meant to say, and there's no way of putting this in words, is that you love a Jew, period. And it has nothing to do with righteous and wicked. So it's not like you see the difference, you make a distinction between righteous and wicked, but you're going to love them both anyway. There is no anyway. There's no need for that clause. You love your fellow Jew, and that's all that needs to be said. What does this mean? It means that any Jew, regardless of his behavior, regardless of his personality, regardless of his standing in society, you must feel related to that Jew. Is that love? We're not going into the nature of love or the emotion of love. We're talking mainly about our connection with our fellow Jew. The connection with a fellow Jew means that regardless of how the other person behaves, no matter how strongly you disagree with the other Jew's behavior, you feel attached, inseparable. You can't dismiss that other Jew because it's your fellow Jew. And you find sometimes, for example in Israel, people who dress in the style of Mea She'arim, who happen to venture into areas outside of Mea She'arim, they make the people very uncomfortable. This reaction has a certain redeemable social worth to it. You see people dressed in very strange ways in Israel. You see Arabs of different religious orders who dress outlandishly, and yet they walk up and down the streets of Yerushalayim and no one pays any attention. Nobody notices. Nobody gives them a second look. But should a Jew from Mea She'arim walk into a non-religious section, he gets angry stares. Why? Because he's dressed funny. Now, why is his dress any funnier than the dress of the Arab mullah, or whatever they're called? It's not any stranger. On the contrary, the Arab is a stranger, and therefore he can dress however he wants, and nobody cares. But when a Jew dresses strangely, then every Jew cares. Why? Because it's my fellow Jew. What is he doing dressed like that? Why do you care how he dresses? Let him dress the way he wants? What do you mean let him dress the way he wants? What is he, a stranger? He's my relative. I have to live with this. I got to explain this guy to my friends. Some non-Jew is going to come along and say, you're Jews, and he's going to include me with him. Nobody's going to associate me with the Arab mullah, so let the mullahs dress the way they want. I don't care. And let them practice as they wish. Let them pray. Let them get on their hands and knees in the middle of the street with their donkeys. I don't care, because it doesn't reflect on me. We're not related. But with a fellow Jew, even though we don't speak the same language, we don't dress the same, we don't eat the same, we don't act the same, we don't believe the same, and if he dresses weird, it makes me uncomfortable, because I have to tell my neighbor that's my relative. And if you say, so don't tell them that it's your relative, tell them it's not your relative, can't do that. It's my fellow Jew. Happened in Entebbe. Among the Jews who were being held captive there was this one man who denied that he was Jewish in order to save his life. He insisted that he was an Austrian, and later could not forgive himself for having done such a thing. He says, how could I stand there and say that the Jews should all remain in Entebbe, but I'm going to leave because I'm an Austrian? he couldn't forgive himself for having separated himself from his fellow Jew, even though they were total strangers. They just happened to be on the same airplane. Because Jews are not strangers, ever. And that's the beginning, the basis, the bedrock of Avas Yisrael. And that is that one Jew cannot disassociate from another, no matter how much he would like to. You may not call that great love. It certainly doesn't sound romantic, doesn't even sound positive. But what we're saying is that these two Jews would like to be disassociated and can't. It's not romantic, but it's real. How do we practice this love? Suppose we have this feeling of being stuck with our fellow Jew, like it or not. Where do we go from there? For this we have a statement in the Gemara, a story about Hillel. A man comes to Hillel and says he wants to be taught the whole Torah on one foot, which means to say that he was either very impatient or had a very limited capacity for learning. He needed it all summed up for him in a few words. So Hillel summed it up for him by saying, what is hateful to you, do not do to others. That's the whole Torah, the rest is commentary. Now, where did Hillel dig up this statement from? The man wants to know, what is the punchline? What is the essence? What is the bottom line on Yiddishkeit? So Hillel comes up with this statement that doesn't appear anywhere in Torah. Doesn't appear anywhere in the Talmud. He made up his own statement. He made up his own Yiddishkeit. If you want to sum up Torah, what you would do is pick one mitzvah that represents the whole Torah and say, this is it. This is the point of the whole thing. Why didn't Hillel tell him one of the mitzvahs? Why did he make up his own commandment, a new theology? So the commentaries say that basically he was referring to the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew as yourself. That is the whole Torah. But then the question is, if that's the mitzvah he was referring to, then why didn't he just come out and say it? It's just as brief. Come out and say, the ultimate mitzvah, the epitome of Yiddishkeit is, love your fellow Jew as yourself. That's the whole Torah, the rest is commentary. It would have been just as neat and a little more authentic. So why did Hillel come up with this original statement of his? Why didn't he quote the Torah? And then another question. If a person comes to you and is impatient and needs to be told something quickly, then he needs you to tell him something definitive. What did Hillel say? Hillel gave him a very vague, open-ended kind of suggestion. What is hateful to you, don't do to others. So what is hateful to you? Well, you got to go figure it out. And what if what is hateful to me, my neighbor happens to like? So I shouldn't do it for him because it's hateful to me? That's why he can't have it? It's like the guy once said, I hate to be in debt. That's why I don't give anybody any loan. Because what I hate for myself, I wouldn't want to do to you. So I'm not going to put you into debt. Tzemach Tzedek explains that what Hillel was saying was really a very clearly defined and practical thing. He said, we notice a very strange and interesting phenomenon. A person can admit his own faults, see his own faults very clearly, own up to them, talk about them, express it publicly, and yet if another person would say the exact same thing about him, he would be insulted, he'd be offended, he'd be hurt. So if I stand with a group of friends and I say to them, I don't know what to do anymore, I'm so lazy, or I'm so inconsiderate, or I'm so stingy that it's really not funny anymore, and one of them says, yeah, that's right, I would be insulted. Why? Why can I honestly admit to a fault within myself, and yet if you point to that very same fault, if you point to it, I'm offended? The difference is that when I see my faults, I see them within a particular kind of framework. I'm already convinced that I am basically a worthwhile, significant person. Having assured myself of that, I can then proceed to look at my faults, even talk about them, without doing any damage to myself, without hurting myself. But when somebody else sees my fault, it's not necessarily within that framework. It's not necessarily protected by that conviction of significance. When somebody else sees my faults, to them it means, well, since you've got this fault, and you may have other faults, then how important can you be in total? How significant is your whole life anyway if you have these faults? And that's the part that hurts. As a matter of fact, we could make the argument that ultimately that is the only thing that hurts. Nothing else hurts. Nobody can be so arrogant as to be offended when accused of lying. We all lie, one way or another. We all lie. And we're not so arrogant as to refuse to admit it. To ourselves, we do admit it. So when somebody calls me a liar, why does it hurt? Actually, it has nothing to do with the detail of the accusation. It has to do with what is implied. And what's implied is exactly the same as if I were being accused of being stupid or lazy or jealous or incapable. It's all the same thing. Any inability on my part, any flaw in my personality implies total insignificance. And that's what hurts. It's not so much what you think of me as long as you think of me. It's the suggestion that who needs to think of you, or what is there to think of? It's not the inflicting of pain or the inflicting of punishment. It's the fear of abandonment. It's the fear of rejection, not of criticism. We fear criticism only because we're afraid it's going to lead to rejection. Were it not for that, we would be very comfortable hearing and accepting criticisms because we know it's true. We can't honestly deny every criticism we hear because they're all true to some degree. What we can't tolerate, what makes us react defensively, is the suggestion that maybe we would be best off being ignored or rejected. That's why in punishing children, the Gemara says, if you want to punish a child, punish him. But don't tell him you're going to punish him. A slap is a slap. But if you tell the child you're going to get it, what am I going to get? The fear is much more damaging than the slap. Anybody can take a slap. Matter of fact, we see children who are horribly abused, and yet they take it. But when you start rejecting, when you threaten abandonment, that's far worse than an overdone spanking. To tell a child who's misbehaving somewhere on the road between here and New York that you're going to throw him out of the car and he's going to have to walk home is much worse than walloping him, because abandonment cuts to the core of our existence. A slap? You get over it. I'm not minimizing the damage that physical punishment can do to a child, but I'm saying that relative to what abandonment can do, corporal punishment is nothing. And the same is true for adults. It doesn't do any damage to the ego to admit that I'm not the smartest, or the nicest, or the strongest, or the most talented. That which hurts, that which is hateful to me, is to have my faults taken out of this framework, taken out of the conviction that I'm basically a worthwhile human being, and having my worthlessness exposed. So when Hillel said to this man, what is hateful to you, don't do to others, he wasn't being vague. He was referring to a very specific thing. He was talking about that which is hateful, that thing, not whatever is hateful, but that which is hateful. Everybody knows what that is, and that you don't do to others. What is that? Seeing another person's fault without recognizing their significance first. And that's what we hate to have people do to us. And that's what we shouldn't do to others. So what Hillel was doing for this man was summing up all of Torah in one mitzvah. The mitzvah of loving a fellow Jew as yourself. But since this man was very impatient, not very ambitious, if Hillel had told him, love your fellow Jew as yourself, that's Judaism, he would have said, I'm sorry, that sounds impossible. It's too demanding. It's too idealistic. I can't. I'll never be able to do that. So Hillel took that very same mitzvah, translated it for him into practical application. What does it mean to love your fellow Jew as yourself? What does it mean? It means that just as you know that there is something worthwhile about you, even though you have faults, That's what you must know about your fellow Jew. That no matter how the other Jew behaves, no matter how the balance of virtue and sin in the other person's life turns out, in spite of it all, there's something very valuable about this person. The fact that he's a Jew. What does as yourself mean? How can you love anyone as much as yourself? So the truth is that the statement as yourself doesn't necessarily mean as much as. Because how much do you love yourself? That's again an intangible. What does it mean? How are you going to love another? How are you going to love another Jew? How are you going to love all Jews? The answer is the same way you love yourself. How will you love? The way you love yourself. How do you love yourself? What does self-love mean? What is the nature? What are the properties of self-love? Self-love means that before I will see a fault in myself, I am already convinced that I am important. No matter what I make of my life, I was born significant. No matter what my body and human personality turn out to be, when I grow up, my neshama is already valuable. And with that knowledge, with that security, I can look at my faults and not be hurt. That's how I love myself, and that's how I should love another Jew. Don't look at the faults until you know whose faults you're looking at. You're looking at the faults of a Jew. The Rabbi said it recently. When talking to another Jew, you have to realize that every Jew is an only child to God, and God is the King of Kings. The prophet describes the Jew as the apple of God's eye. And therefore, when you talk to another Jew, bear in mind whose child this is. The apple of whose eye is this? So that even though you can't see any virtue in the person himself, he's not behaving like the child of a king of kings. He doesn't look like a child of the King of Kings. So he doesn't look like it. But you have to remember who his father is. There's a story in the Torah about the time after the flood. Noach came out of the ark, planted a vineyard, made himself some wine, and some embarrassing things happened. He had 3 sons, and the Torah tells us that one son went into the tent, and he saw his father was uncovered. He saw his father's nakedness. He came and told the other brothers. The other 2 sons went. They walked in backwards, covered their father, and did not see his nakedness. Now, what exactly is going on here? They knew to cover him, but they didn't see that he was naked. And if they saw that it was naked, that he was naked, what does it mean that they didn't see their father's nakedness? What is this? They walked in backwards. Obviously, they knew that something was wrong. So what's the Torah trying to tell us here? The first son walked in, and his reaction to what he saw was that there was something not nice about his father's behavior. His father was drunk, and he had become uncovered in his tent. The other sons walked in, and they too saw that something wasn't right. But what their reaction was is not that there is something wrong with their father. Their reaction was, there is something we ought to do. That's what they responded to. That's what they picked up on. They saw something not right, and their reaction was, we are supposed to do something about this. Not, who is it that is not being right? That wasn't what struck them. It's not that they saw their father's nakedness. They didn't see anything naked about their father. How then did they know to cover him? Because they saw nakedness that needed to be corrected. The condition begged to be corrected. So what they reacted to was the obligation that this condition would place on them. They did not see it as a definition of their father. The first son walked in, and he saw what was happening as a definition of the father. And that's why he didn't cover him. You see something nasty, instead of going out and telling your brothers, do something about it. Cover him. But he didn't cover him. Why? Because he didn't notice an obligation upon himself. What he saw was a definition of his father. So what does that have to do with him? How does he fit in? The other sons responded the other way. They didn't say, uh-oh, look at our father, look at him. It was, we should do something. This calls for something. What does it call for? It calls for a blanket. So they went and they got a blanket. But their father's nakedness, they didn't see. They saw an obligation, a mitzvah to be performed. The situation called for an action on their part, not for a new definition, a reevaluation of their father's virtue. That's what Hillel was saying. What is hateful to you, don't do to others. You don't want your faults to be treated as a definition of you. You may have a fault, true, but the fault doesn't define you. I know my faults, but I am not my faults. I'm a Jew. As a Jew, I have faults. And when not threatened, I can admit to them. So when somebody else sees my fault, what the Torah wants in the mitzvah of Avas Yisrael is that if you see a fault, see it as something that you need to help correct. Something is calling for your attention, not for a definition of the person in whom the fault is seen. So when we see somebody else doing something wrong, it shouldn't give us a new insight into the evil nature of people. It should urge us to do something about it, because in truth, that's the only reason that God permits one person to see the faults of another. God created the world, and He created it carefully, thoughtfully. Every aspect, every detail of nature God created purposefully. Why did God create people into such a condition where one person's faults are visible to another? Didn't have to be this way. Why should we be able to see faults in another person? It would be very disappointing if God turned out to be into Lashon Hara, that God likes to spread gossip. And that's why He created the world in such a way that if I do something wrong, everybody's going to know. Everybody's going to find out. In a sense, God is telling everybody what I did wrong. God commands us not to spread gossip, not to slander, and certainly He wouldn't do it Himself. And yet He created a world in which it seems that one person's fault, one way or another, gets carried over to other people. So why did God do this? Obviously, if God allows us in any given moment, in any given condition, to see another person's faults, it is not the fault of the other person that we are meant to see. What God is showing us is an opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah, the purpose for which we were created, by seeing something that needs to be corrected in another Jew. If I'm shown something not nice about another Jew, something un-Jewish about him, it's not so that I would know how to evaluate him, how to judge him. I have no business evaluating him. The reason I see a lapse of Yiddishkeit is because it's my job to fix it. It's my obligation. It's something I have yet to do. Now, when I see other person's faults, my reaction should be, what am I being told? And it can be one of two things. Either seeing the other person's faults means that the other person will not improve their behavior unless I help them, because that's the way God set it up. There are people who need partners in order to start a business. There are people who need a partner in order to get married. I mean, everybody needs a partner to get married to. And there are partners in Yiddishkeit. Sometimes my Yiddishkeit can't get off the ground until a particular person, a fellow Jew, would come along, whom God had already ordained to be my Yiddishkeit partner, my soul partner, is going to come along and make me do the Jewish thing. And without that particular person, it's not going to happen. And that's why you find very often that you can talk to your fellow Jew about a certain mitzvah until you're blue in the face and nothing happens. And then somebody else comes along and says a few words, and your friend goes ahead and does the mitzvah. And you say, wait a minute, what did the other person say that I didn't say? How come he was successful where I failed? Actually, it just wasn't your thing in life. There are many opportunities that God sets up for you because you're supposed to be the one to improve that particular detail of the world. Other details of the world, you will not improve. It wasn't yours to improve in the first place. So there are times when we see a fault in another person, because we are the one who is supposed to be there to correct that fault for the person or with the person. Therefore, if you see another person doing something wrong, you reprimand him. Why must you reprimand him? Because he's being bad? Because he's being bad? No. Because if God is letting you see this fault, it must be your job to fix it. So fix it because it's your job, not because the other person is so bad. The other possibility is that what you're seeing in the other person doesn't exist in him at all. You're seeing a fault in another person, and there's no such fault in that person. The fault is in you. But you're seeing it reflected off the other person. It doesn't exist in the other person. It exists only in you. We don't ever really question our own worth. And even when we question it, we don't really question it. And what happens when a person starts doubting their own self-worth is really another way of indulging oneself. It may be strange and backwards or inverted or crazy, but that's what we do. We doubt our self-worth because we love ourselves so much. And so we indulge in endless doubting of self-worth because we're a little bit too moral, a little bit too refined and embarrassed to sit there and think, I'm so wonderful, I'm so good, I'm terrific. We'd be ashamed to let ourselves do that. But we do want to harp on ourselves. We want to be preoccupied with ourselves, and it just won't do to walk around saying, look at me, I'm terrific. So what choice do we have? We walk around saying, look at me, I'm terrible. I'm nothing. I've got this problem, I've got that problem. And if something goes wrong, who do you think is to blame? Me. This is a terrific gimmick. It keeps you in the limelight constantly, and no one can ever accuse you of being arrogant. So you have the best of both worlds. You are humble, and at the same time, totally preoccupied with yourself. What could be better? So underneath it all, you love yourself as much as anyone ever has. Self-love is a given. You can't get around it. How then can we ever see our fault? When we see a fault in another person, our immediate reaction should be, what's that got to do with me? Not, oh, I didn't know he was that bad. I knew he was bad. But this, that should not be the reaction. Our reaction should be, why do I need to see this? Why is it part of my life to become aware of such a thing? What is it trying to tell me? What am I supposed to do about this? Does it mean that I'm supposed to help this man fix it? Does it mean that I'm seeing myself reflected in the other person? What does it mean about the other person? Nothing. God doesn't gossip. He's not trying to tell you anything about the other person. Take it a step further. If the other person's fault offers me the opportunity to make myself better, to show me something in myself that I'm not seeing, to give me an opportunity to do a Jew a favor, then not only shouldn't I see the ugliness in the other Jew, but on the contrary, I owe him or her a debt. I am becoming better. I'm growing and improving through this person. So I'm indebted to this person. And that's true even if the other person's fault consists of hurting me. That's their fault. The fault I'm seeing in them is that they keep hurting me, that they're cruel to me. And even that, I have to accept as something, a part of my life, part of my experience, a part of my fate. And this person is the messenger through whom this fate is coming to me. Therefore, as they do in New York, if somebody delivers a package, you give them a tip. So if somebody's here to deliver to you what you need to experience in your life, not only don't you have reason to be hateful, but on the contrary, you owe him a thanks. The final step in Avas Yisrael is that if all this is true, that every Jew has a divine soul, that regardless of how he behaves, that soul remains, and is therefore a very significant person and is carrying out God's mission and so on, Then the next logical question is, where's the evidence? Where is the evidence of the presence of this godly soul? Where do you see it? So Ahavas Yisrael, taken to its fullest expression, is the ability to discover evidence, symptoms, signs of the presence of a divine soul, even in that person who at first glance doesn't seem to have any soul at all. For example, we can be very critical of a Jew who says, I don't observe rituals, I don't go to shul, I don't keep kosher, I don't observe Shabbos, I don't believe in Torah, but I'm a good Jew. We could be very critical of that. We can call him a hypocrite, and we can dismiss the person as being shallow. You don't do anything Jewish? So what do you mean you're a good Jew? So we could do that, or we could look at it from a whole different angle. If the Jew doesn't keep Shabbos, and he doesn't keep kosher, doesn't go to shul, doesn't believe in Torah, why must he insist that he's a good Jew? What makes him do that? Why does he insist that he is Jewish at all? Why doesn't he just forget it? Why does he say, I may not be observant as you, or as ritualistic as you, but I am as good a Jew as you? Why doesn't he say instead, look, I don't do mitzvahs, not into rituals, I'm not Jewish, leave me alone, sei mir gesund? He can't say that. Why? Because the neshama won't let him. The neshama will let him get away with certain things, but only so far. There comes a point for every neshama where the neshama says, that's far enough. Wait a minute, you are Jewish. So what can be seen as hypocrisy can also be seen as the symptom and the sign of the presence of a Jewish neshama. The Rebbe once said, do you know how precious it is to God when a Jew goes to shul once a year on Yom Kippur, and he gets out of the car, and at the door of the synagogue, he puts out his cigarette because it's not nice to smoke in a shul? And here again you could say, he drove to shul on Yom Kippur? Throw him out. He's smoking on Yom Kippur? It's even worse. He put out the cigarette? That only makes it worse. You're not allowed to put out a cigarette on Shabbos. Or you can say, why did he put out the cigarette? Why did he put it out? He likes to smoke. The Rebbe said this about 25 years ago, before smoking was considered inelegant. He put out the cigarette not because the sign on the shul door said no smoking, but because he felt it would be disrespectful to smoke in a shul. There were a group of Jewish communists in Russia called the Yevsektia. Basically, it means the Jewish section, the Jewish party. And in terms of anti-Semitism, they were probably worse than the Russians themselves. The previous Rebbe was arrested under the communists and originally condemned to die. But who came to arrest him? Jews, Jewish communists. And when they came to tell him that he was being released, again it was the Jewish communists. When they walked in, this supposedly atheistic Jew came into the cell and he said to him, Rebbe, I have good news for you. You're being released. The same man who arrested him. And yet he refers to him as a Rebbe. In those days, that kind of title, any kind of title, was considered subversive. To give anyone a title of reverence is very uncommunistic. Everyone's a comrade. All are equal. And yet this sworn communist comes in and he says Rebbe. Because as much as he was a communist, someplace, somehow, his Yiddishkeit peeked through. And the Rebbe writes in his diary that these two Jewish communists walked into his house at midnight, stationed a couple of guards at the door, arrested everyone who walked in, tore the place up looking for evidence, papers, documents, whatever, interrogated his daughters, intimidated everybody in the house, and in the tumult, the Rebbe's mother woke up. She was getting along in years, and when she walked out into the room and saw what was going on, armed guards, place being torn up, arresting her son, her only son. She got quite upset. And one of the arresting officers, a Jew who had come to arrest the Rebbe, took the Rebbe aside and he said, it'd be okay if you took your mother into another room and quiet her down. And the Rebbe writes in his diary how even this heart of stone, even this cruel person, the cries of a mother were too much for him. Even for this heart of stone, he broke down and for a moment acted like a human being, even though he wasn't supposed to. So the Rebbe is being arrested, being torn away from his family, threatened with death, and yet he notices that even in this worst heart of stone, there's a glimmer of menschlichkeit, a glimmer of decency. And that's a talent that we need to develop. The talent to pick up on those little pieces of evidence, those little telltale signs that behind the facade, behind what meets the eye, there is a divine soul, and there's something very Jewish about the Jew. I remember talking to a man who was saying that he can't tolerate people being picky and fanatical about little details in Yiddishkeit. He says you have to be more relaxed about things. A while later, he was very upset because he had to get home to light his yahrzeit candle for his mother. So I said to him, what are you so upset about? You don't light it today, you'll light it tomorrow. What's the big deal? You'll light the candle, but you'll do it tomorrow. He said, yeah, but today is the yahrzeit. I said, picky. Come on, your mother's gone anyway. What's the big deal? You'll light it tomorrow. Next week. What's the difference? It's the thought that counts. But he wouldn't hear of it. You have to light it on the yahrzeit. What are you talking about? So who's the fanatic? You get these little glimpses, little pieces of evidence of how Jewish he really is. So in pursuing the mitzvah of Avas Yisrael, we start with the awareness that every Jew is a piece of God, and that if that piece of God is not evident in the person's life and in his behavior, then it is your job to bring it out, to help him reveal it, to help that person discover his own godliness, her own Yiddishkeit. And until you do that, you have to find evidence in the person's behavior, even if it is circumstantial evidence. You have to find those little glimmers of proof that there is, in fact, a divine soul in this person. The best part of the whole thing is that as idealistic as it sounds, and it does sound very idealistic, the fact is that in many ways we're doing it already. Because, like the man said, Jews are religious without knowing it. We already do most of this, only we do it unconsciously. We don't notice. We don't put effort into it. It happens because we're Jewish, and that's the Jewish condition. But what God wants is that we should not be content with the way He created us, but that we take those talents He gave us and work with them to develop them, to cultivate them, to expand and enlarge them. And the only way to do that is by observing, by watching, by catching ourselves, by training ourselves to do it. So that it shouldn't happen accidentally, but purposefully. So that we don't have virtue in spite of ourselves, but because of ourselves. We have a good example of how we sometimes behave versus how we really are. There's a lot of talk about a rift between the religious and the non-religious Jews in Israel. And sometimes you hear the discussion, and there's violence in their eyes, and there's hatred in their voice. It's a horrible thing that's happening. And you feel terrible, because were it not for that, Mashiach would be here. And as terrible as that rift is, as terrible as that hatred between them seems to be, we know that as soon as the chips are down, when things get serious, those differences will be immediately forgotten. And as soon as the danger is over, we'll go back to fighting like chickens. So which is the truth? Are we really being ourselves when we put aside all those differences because something has to be done and we do it together? Or are we really being ourselves when we bicker and fight and pick at each other and complain and ridicule and accuse? something happened to the Holy Land 2,000 years ago that caused the Jews to be exiled and the land to be destroyed. Whatever that was, it hasn't healed yet. Something happened in the city of Yerushalayim, which is the city that brings the people together, because every other city in Israel was divided among the tribes. But this part belonged to all tribes. Yerushalayim belongs to everybody at the same time. So Jerusalem is supposed to be that one ingredient that brings Jews together, that unites Jews. And yet 2,000 years ago, something happened in Jerusalem. Jews did not get along there. That's what brought about the destruction of the temple. That's what brought about the exile. And what will bring the end of the exile is when we undo the cause, when we once again get along, when we are one again, and particularly in Yerushalayim. The ironic thing is that that's where oneness is the hardest to come by. It's a small place, it's a little city, it's a holy place, and yet the people who live there cannot get along. It seems like where a certain virtue is most needed, that's where it is most difficult to come by. It's a very painful thing. To come to Israel for the first time, you want to go to the holy city of Yerushalayim, and you see these signs saying this one is bad, that one is bad, don't step on my territory, don't walk on this block. It's terrible. There's a certain intensity about the holy city. And if that intensity isn't on the mark, in other words, if the intensity isn't channeled in the right direction, it becomes terribly destructive. So the intensity itself would be a nice thing, but when it gets fragmented and everyone's intense in a different direction, that's very painful. But there's no question that bringing ourselves together, being able to see past the externals to the neshama of a Jew, that's what will heal the wound of exile, of Golus. That's what brings Mashiach. I heard a native of Mea She'arim say to a friend of his that he wishes that he would have as much fear of God, that he would be as God-fearing as an American Jew who goes to synagogue once a year. Because the man who goes to synagogue once a year does so only because he's Jewish. Nobody forces him. Whereas if you live in Mea She'arim, then how can you not show up in shul? Everyone would ask questions. You have to come to shul. So he says, I hope for you that you would have the same feeling for God as an American Jew has who goes to shul once a year. That's not to say that there's any virtue in going to shul once a year. The virtue is in doing it out of genuine, unadulterated Jewishness. Not because you happen to belong to a group that demands that you show up in shul. In order to maintain your standing, you have to show. That ability to see a virtue where it's not evident, for a person who comes from Mea She'arim, is a very good sign. The ice is thawing.